Welcome back, and we have the second lecture of Monika Aidelsburger, who is going to talk about anomalous Floquet topological systems. Please, Monika.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to the second part. So just as a very brief reminder, for those of you who have listened to the first lecture, but it's actually not fully necessary. It's basically two separate parts, more or less, because I've mostly introduced the square lattice and how periodic driving can be used in order to engineer artificial magnetic fields. And specifically, in the end, I showed a few things or properties about the Hofstadter model, which splits into these many magnetic mini-bands that can have non-zero Chern numbers. Now, today, I actually want to focus on a different type of lattice, which is a hexagonal lattice geometry. And there's a second very famous topological lattice model, that is the so-called Haldane model, which can be realized in these lattices. So what we have here is a real nearest neighbor tunnel coupling Tij. There's a complex next nearest neighbor coupling where this phase phi appears, and there's a sublattice energy offset delta AB. So if you look at the schematic over here, you see the unit cell of a hexagonal lattice, and there are black and white sides. So these black sides are labeled as B sides, and the white sides are labeled as A sides, and this delta AB would then be a potential energy difference between the two. And it turns out that as a function of the phase phi on the complex next nearest neighbor hopping and the sublattice energy offset delta AB, this model hosts topological phases. And specifically, what distinguishes this model from the Hofstadter model is that if you look at the effective magnetic flux that would be piercing this unit cell, it's actually equal to 0. So there's some non-trivial structure, there are staggered fluxes within the unit cell, but there's actually no net magnetic field. So in a sense, it is slightly different compared to the Hofstadter model. All right, so the plan is to basically first introduce or remind you about the topology of hexagonal lattices, first starting from the uniform graphene type dispersion, and explaining a little bit what happens if we break time reversal symmetry, what happens to the band structure, and what happens to the barrier curvature and the Chern number. And based on that, I will actually connect to the lecture from Mark Ratner from last week, who also talked about these anomalous Floquet topological systems, which we can realize in such a driven hexagonal lattice as well. And in the very end, I would like to show you some of the recent work that's ongoing, where we are trying to study indeed what happens at the edge of a system, so that we can see the dynamics of topological edge modes in these driven lattices. All right. So let me start with a hexagonal lattice to begin with. So just very basic. So I will start very slowly introducing how to solve this model, and then explain how we modify the band structure. Okay, so I already mentioned that we have these two-side unit cells. We have A and B sublattices, and we can write down a very simple type binding model where here we have uniform hopping J between neighboring sites. Now, if you draw the Brillouin zone in reciprocal space, you can either draw here this hexagonal Brillouin zone with the K and K prime points at the edges, or if you look at the reciprocal lattice vectors, it's actually this B1 and B2. So the unit, the Brillouin zone is actually diamond shaped, if you wish. Okay, so we have two subbands, and these two subbands actually touch at so-called Dirac points. So let me go back to the schematic drawing over here. So this is the first Brillouin zone of the hexagonal lattice, and here at the edges, you see the points that are labeled as K and K prime. And this is a 3D plot of the graphene dispersion. So here these edges, so basically the upper band of this two-band model is cut a little bit. And here these edges, these cones are at the K and K prime points. So here we have a linear dispersion that intersects at these touching points. And now you can also look at the geometric properties of the band or the barrier curvature. And if you do that, you will find that there's positive and negative barrier curvature very strongly localized at these K and K prime points, at these band touching points. So there are delta functions located at these points. If you actually gap out the bands, you can also spread them out a little bit. So if you add a sublattice energy offset delta AB, but no time reversal symmetry breaking yet, then you will find that this Berry curvature broadens at these points. And now if you go ahead and you compute the Chern number associated with the start, it would be equal to 0. So essentially the Berry curvature concentrated at K and K prime points, they cancel to 0. All right, now something else that is very interesting is that if you now look at one of these Dirac points and the Berry curvature that is associated with this Dirac point, you can go ahead and compute the Berry flux that is associated with it. So what is the Berry flux? The Berry flux is essentially like this effective magnetic field in momentum space, or if you want, it's the integral of the Berry connection over a small area in the dispersion relation. So instead of computing the integral over the full Brillouin zone, as we would do in order to compute the Chern number, we choose such a local region to compute the associated Berry flux. And for these 2 points, K and K prime, this Berry flux is equal to pi. And we will actually see that later again. It's very characteristic, this Berry flux of pi, which also develops at a band touching point at the topological phase transition. So whenever you have these gap closing points, you can actually learn something about how the topological properties of the band changes just by looking at this value of the Berry fluxes that appear just before and just after the phase transition. All right, so we can actually go ahead in cold atom experiments and measure this Berry flux. And I did not really explain that yesterday, but I had a little drawing on one of the slides, maybe if you have seen that. So the idea is actually to build an interferometer. And the experimental results that I'm going to show are obtained with bosonic atoms. So what we do is we prepare a Bose-Einstein condensate, and you can now really think about it as a wave packet. We will again describe all the things that we see in terms of a semi-classical description, wave packets that are associated with a mean quasi-momentum and a mean position in real space. So if we have such a wave packet, we can go ahead and build interferometers. So we could, for instance, play with internal states and make it move along certain directions. And we can particularly also split it and let it go around different paths. So we can build this interferometer. And the real space analogy to what I'm going to show you would be the Aharonov-Bohm interferometer. So here the idea is that if you have like an electron wave packet and you split it, you make it go around these 2 paths, and you read out the relative phase at the end of your interferometry sequence. The phase it picks up is given by the Aharonov-Bohm phase, which is the flux that pierces the area of the interferometer. But now in our experiments, we can do something similar, and we can do that in momentum space. So now I have a wave packet in momentum space. I have my BEC, my Bose-Einstein condensate, and I can build this interferometer. So I can split it. I can let the parts of the wave function travel along 2 different paths. And at the end, after closing my interferometry sequence, so it explores a region within the dispersion relation, the relative phase that is being picked up is actually given by the integral of the Berry curvature over this region of my interferometer. So this relative phase that I read out at the end of this interferometry sequence actually allows me to measure the Berry flux that is associated with a small area in the dispersion relation in quasi-momentum space. Okay, so how does that work? So let me go in a little bit more detail. What you see here is again the Brillouin zone of the hexagonal lattice. And these 2 blobs, they essentially show the internal states of the atoms that we work with. So we can choose to work with 2 different Zeeman states, for instance, that we denote as spin up and spin down. And the BEC, the condensate wave function, is localized here at the center of the Brillouin zone in quasi-momentum space. So this is actually the lowest state energy eigenstate at Q equal to 0, or in the graphene dispersion, this would be the gamma point. Okay, so I have my Bose-Einstein condensate in the minimum of the band. Now I can apply pi over 2 pi's. So now I change the internal state of the atoms and generate a coherent superposition between spin up and spin down. And in this case, it's actually Zeeman states that have different magnetic moments. So now what I can do is I can again apply a force to adiabatically change the quasi-momentum so that we move in quasi-momentum space along one particular direction. And at the same time, I can apply a magnetic field gradient, or in other words, a spin-dependent force. So if I do that, I can make them go in opposite directions. So I open my interferometry sequence, as illustrated here in this figure that is labeled by this index 2. And then in order to close the interferometry sequence, I apply a pi pulse. So I change the internal state of the atoms and keep the same spin-dependent force, which now makes them travel towards each other again. So this then closes my interferometry sequence. And I can read out the relative phase with a Ramsey protocol. Okay, so now I just probe the relative phase that these two particles have picked up, or the condensate wave function has picked up at the end of my interferometry sequence. And then depending on this region of my interferometer, the area that I explore in quasi-momentum space, I can in principle map out the Berry flux distribution within the band. Okay, and specifically, as you see here, we can measure the Berry flux that is associated with this Dirac point in the graphene dispersion. And this is what you see here in this data that I have taken from Lucia's paper. It's a science paper from 2015. And what you see here is on the horizontal axis, the final point of the closing of the interferometer. So let me start in the center. So here you see in the center, there's the gamma point. That's Q equal to 0. That's my initial starting point. So essentially this point over here means I have actually not done anything. The area of the interferometer is equal to 0. And as we move towards the right-hand side of this horizontal axis, the area of the interferometer successively increases until at some point it encloses the K point. And the K point, remember, is where the Dirac point is, where we have the pi Berry flux. So between this region from gamma to K, yeah.
There's a question in the chat about the quasi-momentum K or crystal momentum. So so what does it refer to in the experiment so that you can change it?
So the idea for changing this quasi-momentum is to apply a force. The force will change the quasi-momentum linearly as a function of time. And if the force is small enough, you basically stay within the same band. So you remain adiabatic with this change. And the mean quasi-momentum of the wave packet simply changes linearly in the direction of the force. Does that clarify? Okay. And then the idea is to combine spin-independent forces. So that would be here along the direction gamma K in order to move the wave packet, and spin-dependent ones, which then go orthogonal to this force that we apply, the spin-independent one. All right, so if I start opening my interferometry area, but I do not yet enclose a Dirac point, the relative phase that we measure is still equal to 0. But then as soon as I start to enclose a Dirac point, it actually jumps to pi. And this is exactly what you would expect, because the geometric phase given by the Berry flux is given by pi if we enclose the Dirac point. Now, if I change the interferometer further, this is actually shown here in this upper right corner, and I make the area of the interferometer larger, it doesn't change anymore. So if I enclose the Dirac point, but I don't add any additional Berry flux to my interferometer area, so we stay at pi. And then it jumps to 0 again, as soon as I start to enclose a second Dirac point. So then the 2 points, the 2 Berry fluxes, they cancel, and the phase that I measure in my interferometry sequence is again equal to 0. And the same happens, of course, if I reverse the direction of the interferometer. So if we go down instead of up, you see the same behavior. As soon as we enclose the Dirac point, you see this jump in the phase of pi. And this is also what you see in the insets. So in the insets, you see the Ramsey protocol that we use in order to extract the phase. So on the horizontal axis, it's the phase associated with the last Ramsey pi over 2 pulse. And as we tune it, you see how the fraction that is transferred to the other spin component changes as a function of this angle. And the black curve is actually a reference sequence, just to be sure that we know when to measure 0. And the blue one is the one that is associated with the interferometer. Okay, so this actually works very nicely. So in principle, we can build this little interferometry sequences in order to map out the geometric properties of the band. Okay, but this is all now about the graphene dispersion, where we have this band touching points between the two subbands. So the question is, how can we actually make this model topological? And this connects to the first slide that I showed to you, where we would like to realize the Haldane model. Okay, so we need to find a way to break time reversal symmetry, or in other words, make this next nearest neighbor hopping between the black sides or between the white sides complex. All right, so how can we do that? There's one way that has been proposed in this seminal paper by Oka and Aoki. That is, we can apply circular shaking. So we literally take the lattice in real space and move it around circular orbits with this frequency omega. So how can we do that? In these optical lattice experiments, we can actually do that by attaching little piezos to the mirrors that reflect the laser beams and redirect them onto our atomic cloud. So by attaching these piezos and modulating them as a function of time, you can move the mirrors around, and this will introduce a change in the position of the lattice in real space. So you really go ahead and you wiggle it around in order to shake the atoms. This is one way of doing it. And I will actually show you a second way of doing it, which is slightly different, but gives rise to the same model. And you can actually see that even nicer in this photonics experiment, and you will hear more about that, because here in this coupled waveguide array, the axis that goes into the plane, so this z-axis, plays the role of time. So you really see how locally these waveguides are wiggled around, which breaks time reversal symmetry. Okay, so this is one way of doing it. And let me show you what happens. So this is actually now taken from this brick wall lattice that has been realized in Tilman Esslinger's lab at ETH in Zurich. But the topology of the lattice is exactly the same. So it doesn't really matter if it has this brick wall type shape or if it has a nice hexagonal unit cell. Okay, so what happens is that this on the right is the dispersion relation of graphene. We have this linear slope at the band touching points. And now if we break time reversal symmetry, what happens is that we open a gap at the Dirac points. So now we have two gapped bands. And in fact, if you look at the Berry curvature distribution, this is what I'm going to show you later on during this lecture, is that now the sign of the Berry curvature or the Berry flux is the same at the two k and k prime points. So they add up instead of canceling, which gives rise to a non-zero Chern number. And in addition, we can also play around with the sublattice energy offset between A and B sides. So this is shown by this larger and smaller dots now that illustrate the corners of this brick wall unit cell. And this again also changes the topological properties of the lattice model. So here you see the topological phase diagram. Sorry for changing notations. On the horizontal axis, this phi is actually the phase that appears in the complex next nearest neighbor hopping. And on the vertical axis, you see delta AB, the sublattice energy offset. Okay, for phi equal to 0 and delta equal to 0, you are in the center of this plot, which is the graphene dispersion. Now, as you break time reversal symmetry, essentially you move along this horizontal line, keeping the delta, the sublattice energy offset equal to 0. So you open up a gap at the Dirac cones, and depending on the sign of the phase, you either generate a band with positive Chern number or negative Chern number. And if you now are somewhere over here in this topological region, if you add a sublattice energy offset between neighboring sites, at some point there's actually a transition to a topologically trivial regime again. Okay, and this we can explore by playing with the modulation protocol and also by applying this potential energy offsets between neighboring sites. Okay, so before I actually show you that indeed we can probe the topological properties of these bands, I would like to connect to the lecture from last week and remind you about these anomalous Floquet topological systems, because the protocol that I'm going to introduce to you is actually very naturally suited in order to enter this regime as well. So yesterday, I've actually only discussed or motivated the idea of periodic driving, by basically motivating that we would like to study model Hamiltonians that we do not have naturally access to in our labs. So I told you we can implement nicely these Hubbard models, but for instance, if we want to study topological physics, that's much more challenging. And that's how I motivated why we need this technique of periodic driving. Okay, so what do we try to do? We want to study quantum Hall type physics, which means we would like to have Chern bands or band structures with non-zero Chern number. And what we also know from these conventional quantum Hall type systems is if we have bands with non-zero Chern number, there are also topological edge modes at the boundary between two topological phases, two distinct topological phases. Or if you think about a quantum Hall bar, it would be the topological material interfaced with vacuum. You know that at the boundary of the system, you have topological edge modes, and the number of these edge modes is directly related to the Chern number of the band that you have populated with electrons, for instance. Okay, but now this actually works beautifully in the high frequency driving limit. So basically what we have done is we have designed or developed driving protocols. We go ahead and say, well, this modulation frequency is now set to a very, very large value. And we can compute a Floquet Hamiltonian using this perturbative expansion, for instance, the Magnus expansion. And then this is our Floquet Hamiltonian. We look at the stroboscopic dynamics and we pretend that essentially we are studying this effective time independent Floquet Hamiltonian. And nicely enough, we can actually go ahead and use all the machinery that we know from static Hamiltonians. So we can go ahead, we can diagonalize it, we can compute the band structure, we can compute the Berry curvature, the Chern number, and all of this nicely connects to the physics of static systems as well. But now it becomes more interesting if we go away from this limit. And this is what has been explained to you already, is the idea of generating anomalous Floquet systems where the driving frequency can be on the order of other energy scales in your lattice model, for instance, the tunnel coupling. And here now something very interesting can happen. So if you look at this reduced Floquet Breuerian zone that spans from minus h bar omega half to plus h bar omega half, you see the situation that we have edge modes that wind around the Floquet quasi-energy spectrum. So this point down here is equivalent to the point up here. And because the Chern number is given by the difference between the number of edge modes leaving the band from the top and entering from below, you see that in this specific example that is shown here in the lower right corner, the Chern number of the band is 0. It's 1 minus 1. I have 1 leaving the band, 1 entering the band. So this is a system with topological edge modes, but bands with 0 Chern number. And this tells you that actually the machinery you know from static systems is not enough. So in this particular setting, it's not enough to just go ahead and compute the Chern number of the band in order to know if the system is topologically trivial or not. You have to do something more. So there are other topological invariants that you need to compute in order to see this interesting behavior. And what motivated us going in this direction is that now you have actually realized a topological system that is genuinely out of equilibrium. So it's a topological phase that only exists in driven system. And of course, that may have new properties that otherwise you cannot have in static systems. So now you can go ahead and explore localization of these systems. You can add this order, and you can ask what many body phases exist in these systems. And this is why we got interested in studying these driven models where the frequency is now on the order of the tunnel coupling in the lattice. Okay, this is more a comment, not a question in the chat, right? Yeah. So that's the photonics experiment that will be introduced, I'm sure.
Yes.
All right. So I will not explain this again in detail. You have seen that already. But this stepwise modulated square lattice has been developed as one of the first examples of these anomalous Floquet systems. And it's very nice in order to get an intuition and what is different and compared to the driven lattice systems at very high frequencies. So just to remind you, you can look at these 4 steps in this fine-tuned situation where tunneling is only turned on along the colored bonds. And it's tuned in such a way that a particle is prepared on the black side would have the exact amount of time needed to tunnel over to the white side. And now if you follow these 4 steps, you see that in the bulk, it basically just moves along the square. So it does not explore the full lattice system. But then if you look at the edge, something more interesting happens. And this also nicely shows you that if you go ahead and just compute the effective time independent Floquet Hamiltonian, you find that it's trivial, because actually in this fine-tuned protocol, after one period of the drive, the wave packet returns to its initial starting point and nothing happens. So if you just look at the stroboscopic dynamics, you may conclude nothing happens. It's just the identity. The evolution operator is simply the identity, and the effective Hamiltonian vanishes. Okay, but as you know, this is not the full story. So if you prepare a wave packet at the edge, at the boundary of the system, it actually shows chiral motion. So it can only travel in one direction. And I just want to highlight 2 things. So first of all, keep in mind that this time-averaged Floquet Hamiltonian is not enough to describe the system. And by playing this game of seeing what happens at the edge, you actually also immediately see that the information about the chirality of the edge mode is encoded in the driving protocol. So you actually need to know what happens within one drive to know if there's a chiral mode at the edge, and to know what's the chirality of the mode at the edge, because you need to know actually how you turn on the couplings within one period of the drive. If you were to look at just stroboscopic dynamics, it's impossible to figure that out. Okay, and this also gives you an idea of the new topological invariants that are needed in order to describe the topological properties of the system. So instead of just looking at the geometric properties as a function of quasi-momentum, Qx and Qy, you need to look at the time evolution within one period. Okay, and again, this is an example that maybe you will see again, just very briefly in these coupled waveguide arrays, in these photonics experiments. It's actually very straightforward to implement these types of protocols, because here you have waveguides, so photons are coupled into these waveguides. And if you bring them closer to each other, then you increase the tunnel coupling. If you bring them further away, you decrease the tunnel coupling. So what you see here is indeed like a unit cell of a square lattice, where the coupling between neighboring sites is modulated as a function of time. So this allows you to realize these the stepwise modulated square, stepwise modulated square lattice. And here it's actually modified a little bit, but what can also be nicely done is actually to look at what happens at the edge and what happens in the bulk. So one defining feature of topology is, of course, the topological edge modes in the system. And what is very nice about these photonic arrays is that you can launch photons now in one of these waveguides that is at the boundary of the system. And you look at the propagation after a certain evolution time, introduce defects, and see that indeed the photons propagate around the edge of the sample. And of course, one can also launch light into one of the bulk waveguides to see that indeed after stroboscopic dynamics, it remains completely localized. It does actually not spread across the bulk in such a stepwise modulated square lattice. Okay, so we would like to do something very similar, but with cold atoms. So we would like to study bulk and edge state behavior, and eventually, of course, include interactions into our system as well in order to study many-body physics. Okay, so how do we characterize these topological properties? I told you computing the Chern number is not enough. Instead, we actually need to compute winding numbers that tell us how many edge modes we have in a specific gap. And from now on, I'm going to actually label these gaps. So I will call the energy gap in the center of the spectrum around zero energy, the zero energy gap, and the other one, the pi gap, which is between Floquet Brillouin zones. And then this is what we like to call the generalized bulk boundary correspondence, which means that we need to compute the winding numbers. We need two invariants to characterize the topology of the two bands, but the connection is still the same. So the number of edge modes in the pi gap minus the number of edge modes in the zero gap will tell you what is the Chern number of the band in between these two. And just to give you an idea of how this computation works or what is new, I just wanted to show you this equation, but you can look up the papers down here, essentially to highlight that here you also have to take the integral over time. So it's really important to take into account the micromotion of the system in order to get out or work out these winding numbers that tell you how many edge modes you have in a certain gap. Okay, so how can we actually get any access to these physics in our cold atom experiments? And so first I need to tell you how we actually make such a hexagonal lattice, and to tell you what type of modulation scheme we implement. So of course, one thing to do would be this current modulation that I've shown you in the beginning, but there's actually another way of doing it. Instead of wiggling around the lattice in real space, you can go ahead and also modulate the tunnel couplings of this hexagonal lattice, very similar to the modulation in the bipartite square lattice. So what we will do is we actually increase the tunnel coupling along these red colored bonds, and we do that in a current manner. So these are 3 snapshots during the modulation protocol. We increase tunneling along the horizontal bonds and then along the other 2. And it turns out that this is actually fairly straightforward to implement. So the hexagonal lattice can be realized by interfering 3 laser beams under 120 degrees, choosing the same frequency and same polarization. And if the intensities of these 3 beams are balanced, meaning they are all exactly the same, you get a homogeneous graphene lattice, a hexagonal lattice with a graphene dispersion. And now if you imbalance, so you change the intensity of one of these 3 beams, you can naturally enhance coupling along one direction. And then the only thing that remains to do in order to have this current modulation is change the intensities of the 3 beams out of phase. And that will exactly give you this modulation protocol that is shown up here. And one of the main differences compared to the stepwise modulated square lattice is actually that we don't go all the way to 0, but we change the modulation between 2 finite values. So we will actually have dispersive bands in our modulation protocol. Okay, so what do we get? So here you see the phase diagram as a function of the modulation frequency and the modulation amplitude. So if we choose this modulation frequency to be very, very fast, it's essentially the same as this current modulation in real space. We gap out the Dirac points and we'll get to the Haldane phase over here in the high frequency limit. And if I compute the spectrum for an infinite strip, but with finite edges, you see the following spectrum. We have 2 bands, and there's an edge mode that develops at the k and k prime points around 0 energy, around the 0 energy gap. And the Chern number of these 2 bands is plus and minus 1. Okay, but now in the extended Floquet zone scheme, I know that there are actually these other copies up here. So I get this infinite repetition of my engineered energy bands, which means that if I now change the modulation frequency, I move these copies closer and closer together until I hit to the point where the modulation frequency is on the order of the band gap, on the order of the bandwidth of these 2 bands. So I have a gap closing point between Floquet zones. So now at this point, I have changed the topology of the bands. They've changed to 0. And I've generated an edge mode in the pi gap while leaving the one around 0 untouched. Okay, so now I have a situation where there are 2 edge modes, one in the pi gap and one in the 0 gap, and the Chern number of the band is equal to 0. And now you can also imagine that if I go further and to the left on this plot, I can move more and more of these copies, Floquet copies, into each other. So there's a series of gap closing points that generate different topological phases. And we've actually studied another one, which is this one over here. There has been a gap closing point around 0 energy, which annihilates this edge mode that was there before. And now this is what we call the Haldane-like phase, because it looks very similar to the Haldane model. It has Chern bands with plus and minus 1, but now the edge mode is actually in this non-trivial pi gap, in contrast to the 0 energy gap. Okay, so this is our phase diagram that we get for the modulation protocol that we have implemented. And now, in order to see that indeed this works, we can first probe where these topological phase transitions happen. And what you see here is the energy gap at the gamma point, so at the center of the Brillouin zone, as a function of the modulation parameters, the modulation frequency and the modulation amplitude. So this black line is where the energy gap decreases to 0. And we will probe the properties of the system along this white line. So basically we go ahead, we measure the properties at these pairs for the modulation parameters, and then we extract at what point does the gap actually close. So this signals where the topological phase transition happens. And then we will, in the next step, also measure how the geometric properties change. Okay, so how do we do that? Again, we use actually the same technique. So we prepare Bose-Einstein condensate or wave packet at the lowest energy in the band, which in the hexagonal lattice would be the gamma point at Q equal to 0. And then we apply a force in order to change the mean quasi-momentum linearly as a function of time. Now, the main difference compared to what I've told you before is that this force is chosen to be large, such that we actually have non-adiabatic transitions to the second band, to the higher lying excited band. Okay, and now this is actually an interferometry sequence, but between two bands. So it's not an interferometry sequence where we split the path in quasi-momentum space, but we generate a splitting between the bands. So we move the wave packet from its initial point across this avoided crossing over here. We do it quickly enough so that a fraction of the particles is transferred to the higher band. And we move to this final quasi-momentum capital Q, where we are interested in measuring the energy difference between the bands. Then we introduce a hold time. We simply wait. Now, of course, the wave function will evolve as a function of time according to its eigenfrequencies that are associated with the two bands. So in the end, we will get an oscillation that actually depends on the energy difference at this point. And in order to read it out, we actually now reverse the direction of the force. We close, or we mix the two fractions again. We close our interferometry sequence. We go back to our initial starting point. And here we measure the fraction of atoms that ends up in the lowest band. And what we get as a function of the hold time is this oscillation. So here's plotted the fraction in the lowest band. And fitting the frequency directly gives us the energy difference at this Q point between the two bands. So using this interferometry sequence, we can actually map out where the gap closing points in this phase diagram are. And this is how it looks. So this is a measurement of the gap closing point as a function of the modulation parameters. So in the high frequency limit over here, you measure a certain energy gap at the gamma point. It increases. So there's a turning point. There's this cusp where the energy gap reaches h bar omega half. It decreases. So there's a first gap closing point for this set of modulation parameters. This signals the first topological phase transition. Then it increases again, and then there's a second one. Okay, so from this, we can actually already guess that the Haldane regime is over here. And then we enter the anomalous regime if we decrease the modulation frequency. Now, I should also say that the solid line is actually given by a Floquet band structure calculation, and there's no free fit parameter. So in this case, where we actually work with non-interacting particles, you see that this periodically driven system can be perfectly described by our Floquet model. And I think it's impressive to see how well that works. Now, there's actually more information in this plot. Remember that the interferometry sequence that I explained to you is a little bit strange in a Floquet context, because I've told you that we generated a splitting of the wave packet between the two bands, and then we measure the oscillation frequency, which corresponds to the gap between the two bands. However, you also know that there's actually this infinite series of copies. So it's a priori not so clear which frequency you actually measure. So what energy gap are you actually extracting from this measurement? And now there's something that helps us, because we actually look at the dynamics after stroboscopic times, after integer multiples of the driving period t. And you can actually easily show that this leads to the following fact, that is, you only measure, or you always measure the smallest energy gap or energy difference that is possible. And you can never measure anything that is larger than h bar omega half. So this means that if we start in the high frequency driving limit, we actually know that we probe the energy gap around zero energy. And this is actually nice, because now as we change the modulation frequency to smaller values, you hit a point where the energy difference around zero and the energy difference around the pi gap, they are exactly equal, and they are exactly equal to h bar omega half. And from this point on, you actually start probing the energy difference between the bands around the pi gap. Okay, and I tell you in a bit why this is interesting. if you go back to this plot, it's the exact same one that I showed you before. You can actually read off from this plot which energy gap is closing. So over here in the high frequency driving limit, as I mentioned, we measure the energy gap around 0 energy. And this cusp here is actually the point where we measure h bar omega half. So this is exactly the point where the energy gap between the two bands is exactly the same across 0 energy or across the pi gap. And from this point on, you know that you start to probe the energy gap between Floquet copies. So this gap closing point actually must happen in the pi gap. So you know that this gap closing point is non-trivial. And then the second cusp actually changes the notion of which gap you're measuring again. And this gap closing point then happens again around 0 energy. So you can get this additional information just from the energy gap measurements. Okay. Now, this is of course only part of the story because it only probes the energy of the bands. But what we would like to see is actually the topology of the bands, and we would like to understand how they change across the topological phase transitions. And here I will actually again make use of a similar measurement that I explained yesterday, this Hall deflection measurement. But now we will use it in order to probe the changes locally. So instead of populating the full band, we only prepare a wave packet that probes a fraction of quasi-momentum state. So a localized wave packet in quasi-momentum space. Okay, so now looking at this family of Hamiltonians that is connected by this white line, we can introduce this additional parameter lambda that just parameterizes this line and ask what the topology of these gap closing points is. So in this three-dimensional parameter space, the gap closing points, they can be characterized by topological charges. So now we have these three parameters, qx, qy, and lambda. And if there's a linear band touching point, the topological charge associated with this singularity is either plus or minus 1. And the sign of this topological charge tells you how the Chern number of the bands change and how the winding numbers in the gaps change. And for this, and in order to learn more about the topology, you only need to be able to measure this topological charge, and you need to know which one of the gaps is actually closing, which we have already investigated with the previous measurements. Okay, and I will actually not go too much into the details because I would like to tell you a little bit more at what happens at the edge. So let me just mention the technique. So the idea is that actually you again prepare this BEC or wave packet at a certain position in quasi-momentum space. Now you again change its position linearly as a function of time, now in an adiabatic way by applying a force. So we want to actually stay within the same band. And if you move now the wave packet across a small region in quasi-momentum space, the Hall deflection that you measure is associated with the Berry curvature that you probe when moving the wave packet across this region. So this is the anomalous velocity that we have already seen yesterday, just in this case, not integrated over the full band, but only over a small region in quasi-momentum space. And indeed, this topological charge of plus and minus 1, it can be seen in the Berry curvature and how it changes across the gap closing point. So what you see here is the Berry curvature distribution in the hexagonal lattice just before and just after such a topological phase transition. So here I plotted this diamond shape, which is also shown again here on the left. So we can either plot the hexagonal Brillouin zone or this diamond-shaped Brillouin zone. And the diamond-shaped Brillouin zone, these two red dots here associated with the Dirac points, the K and K prime points, and they are both positive. But what happens just before the phase transition is that at the gap closing point, which happens here at the gamma point or at q equal to 0, there's this pi Berry flux that develops at the position where the singularity is about to happen, and it flips sign across the phase transition. And this change from positive to negative tells you the sign of the topological charge. So either it changes from positive to negative or the other way around. And this we can see by making this local Hall deflection measurements. So we take our condensate, we move it through this tiny region around q equal to 0, and we measure the Hall deflection associated with it. If the Berry flux is positive, it goes, let's say, to the left. If it's negative, it will move to the right. And from this local deflection of the cloud, we can then infer what's the topological charge of this gap closing point. And then in combination with the energy gap measurements, we have a full characterization of the bulk topological properties of the system. And here I just show you the final result, how such a measurement looks like. So this is this local Hall deflection that we denoted as S in the different regimes. So you see, you basically get no deflection here in the Haldane regime because there's almost no Berry curvature at the gamma point. Then the cloud gets deflected stronger as we move towards the gap closing point. And then there's the sudden change, the sudden jump in the direction of the local Hall deflection. And this then allows it to extract the topological charge. So here on top, you see little plots of the Berry curvature distribution, and you see this change in the local Berry flux that happens exactly at the singularity. And from this, you can then actually also learn how the winding numbers change and which one of the winding numbers, the one around zero energy or the one in the pi gap changes. Okay, so this is all about the bulk topological properties. And maybe I should actually stop here. If you don't have time, I can still flash one picture in the end. But let's maybe just see if there are any questions about these bulk measurements.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Monika. There's time, plenty of time for questions. Fabio.
Nice. Again, amazing presentation, Monika. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Look, in some moment, usually slide mentioned about the topological transition, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know, how do you classify these transitions, if it is a first order or second order, and if you have carried on a study about the universality class of these transitions of the system?
Oh, that's a very good question, but I'm actually not, I don't think I can give you a satisfying answer. So I actually did not look at how critical exponents behave for these topological phase transitions. So I'm actually not the right person to ask, I'm afraid. I did not look too much into the details of that.
Right.
Sorry.
Thank you for the attention. No, that's no problem.
Okay.
Okay. Are there any further questions? I don't see any at the moment. So maybe you can continue.
Yeah. Okay. So then, yeah, let me share a few ideas on how to study these edge modes in our system. And maybe let me start by just introducing why that may be challenging in the first place. And the reason why it's challenging is that our atoms are usually trapped in laser beams, so harmonically confining potentials. So what we typically do not have is something like a sharp interface. So if you go ahead and look at your Hall bar geometry that has a natural interface with vacuum or air, we don't really have that. It's like a smooth ball where we trap our atoms in. There's, however, one way that somehow naturally introduces hard walls or sharp edges. And this is the idea of synthetic dimensions, which you have also already heard about. And in our language, that means that in our two-dimensional system, we replace one of the real space axes by an internal degree of freedom. So for instance, we can use Zeeman states and couple them with laser beams. And this is shown schematically in this figure. So you have a lattice along the x direction, and you have Zeeman states, internal states of your atom, which are these colored balls over here. And then you can introduce two photon Raman couplings, for instance, in order to couple these internal states. So this creates an effective two-dimensional space, but now in one real space and one synthetic dimension. And again, you can imprint complex phases or complex hoppings, in particular along the synthetic dimension, because as you know, if you introduce laser couplings between internal states, you have a Rabi coupling, which inherently is complex. So the phase factor of your laser beam will appear in the Rabi coupling frequency. So this allows you to engineer something like a synthetic Hofstadter model, as shown here in this little cartoon. And because you are coupling internal states, there's a natural end. So you may have 3 internal states, maybe 5. In the case of dysprosium, which is the paper down here, you have 17, but at some point you will hit an end and then there's no more state to couple to. Okay, so now if you prepare a wave packet in a specific initial internal state, you can prepare it on the edge. So if it's the outermost internal state you can couple to, then you have this natural boundary and you can see this very nice skipping orbits, for instance, that have been seen in the synthetic Hall ribbons. So this has been done, but of course it has different properties. So if you think about many-body systems or studying many-body dynamics in such a system, it becomes a little bit more involved because you actually have only one real space dimension, which means that all these colors, all these different flavors, they sit on the same lattice side, which means in the synthetic direction, if you turn on interactions like normal Hubbard interactions, they are infinitely ranged. And of course, this gives rise to different phases, also interesting phases, maybe other phases that you cannot access with local Hubbard interactions. I'm just saying it's different and it's maybe more involved. Okay, so we went ahead and actually tried to do something like that in real space. Okay, so how do we do that? So first of all, keeping this analogy to synthetic dimensions, we want to generate something that is local in real space. And the way we do is we use an objective in order to generate a tightly focused trap, such that our BEC that we load into this tightly focused trap has a very small extent in real space. So here this spot is focused to about 1.1 micrometer, and we localize our small BEC in the small trap. Now, the second thing that we need is some type of edge. And the way we do that is we use a spatial light modulator or this digital micromirror device, which here it's seen on the picture here in the center. It's a 2-dimensional chip with tiny little micromirrors that you can switch on and off. And this you can use in order to shape the intensity profile of your laser beam. So specifically, you could do it such that half of your beam is bright and the rest is dark. And then you project this pattern into your atomic plane. And if we use a repulsive potential, this will generate like an edge where the atoms cannot travel through. And schematically, in the 2D plane, this is how it would look. So we have our hexagonal lattice. Here, the one part of the lattice would be blocked by the repulsive light. And then we can move our wave packet close to the edge and just see how this wave packet propagates. And in our case, the width of the edge is on the order of 2 to 3 lattice sides. Okay, so how does that work? So first of all, we load this BEC in this tiny dimple trap, and then we let it expand. And the first thing in order to benchmark our system was doing this expansion without the edge. So we just look at what happens in the bulk. So this is how a snapshot, now an in situ snapshot of our cloud looks like. So it's just one blob in the center of our lattice. And then as we let it expand, you see this nice, beautiful hexagon that emerges. And why is that? Well, it's because we have localized this BEC. So actually all the quasi-momentum states within the band are occupied. And the velocity with which the particles expand is given by the band velocity or the derivative of this dispersion relation. And this is how, if you just go ahead and you compute these band velocities, this is how you see why this hexagon emerges if you let the particles expand from this tiny dimple trap. Okay, so this is already nice. And now we can do the same thing, but we move it to the edge. And here the edge is aligned along this dotted line. So the upper part is actually blocked. So there's a wall. And we watch the wave packet propagate exactly same way as in the previous slide. And what you see is that it nicely follows the edge. And there's basically nothing that is propagating into the bulk. So we can also reverse the chirality of the modulation and see it propagates in the opposite direction. And you can already see by eye that the mean velocity of the wave packet is the same, but just changes sign. We can see that more clearly if we take difference images between these two realizations. I hope I've actually also included that. So this is actually a straight line. So you may still be able to construct some, I don't know, whatever way you could, like, I don't know, smash atoms in the wall and then argue why these wave packets propagate along this edge. But what we have done in order to convince ourselves that this is really something topological is we have generated a disk. So now we block the potential within this dashed line. So we have this disk that blocks where the atoms can go. And what you see is that the wave packet, these atoms indeed nicely move around this ring-shaped potential. And again, if we change the chirality of the modulation, they go in opposite directions. And if you take the if difference images, you nicely see that the atoms wrap around this cylinder that you generate with the repulsive potential. And this is another straight line just to show you that essentially we can play with the shape of the edge and make the atoms go in whatever form we would like. And just to give you an idea about the scale, so this bar down here is the length of 10 lattice sites. So we propagate about 20 and sometimes up to 30 lattice sites in this system. And okay, so these are some of our first results. And actually it's quite fun to play with that, because something that we can do in the lab, which is maybe a little bit more challenging to do for solid state realizations or other experimental platforms, is we can play with the shape or the nature of this edge that we have generated. So first of all, what we can do is we can make it more smooth. So we can actually go away from this sharp limit and see how the velocity of the edge mode changes. And actually what happens is if you start to make this potential more smooth, this linear dispersion of the edge mode starts to hybridize with the bulk bands. So it will gradually slow down as you make the edge more smooth. And another question that we have been more interested now in asking ourselves, so trying to understand better, is what is the minimum height of the wall that you need in order to see the topological edge modes appearing? So what's the minimal gap or chemical potential that you need to apply in order to see them? And yeah, I have one more plot to show you. So this is actually the one where we have changed the sharpness of the wall. So on the left, you see what we expect, like how the resolution of our imaging system changes. So we make it gradually worse. And you see that actually, indeed, the edge mode slows down. So the velocity decreases, which is explained by this hybridization with the bulk bands. And yeah, so just to give you a little bit of an idea or outlook about the things that we would like to do. Specifically, what we would like to do is add this order. And here on the right, you see how that may look like. So we have actually generated this type of speckle potential that we can project onto the atoms and ask if we can indeed see such an anomalous Anderson-Floquet topological insulator in our system, where all the bulk states are completely localized and we see them coexist with extended topological edge modes. And then, of course, it would be interesting to ask the question if this is also stable in a many-body regime. So if we add interactions, if there's a many-body localized phase that coexists with topological edge modes, which would be very nice. And yeah, to do that, we will again do expansion in the lattice. And it turns out this anomalous Floquet system has actually a very, very interesting band structure. So these are expansion images similar to the ones that I showed you before in the graphene lattice. But in the anomalous regime, the expansion is strongly modified. So this is again in the bulk, and you see that the particles essentially don't expand. And this is due to these states at zero band velocity. So there's this ring of degenerate minima that appears in the band structure, which is usually called mode. And there's actually also Berry curvature concentrated around this ring. And so there's also a few nice ideas on what to study in this interesting band structure. So just to give you an idea of where this can go. All right, that's all I wanted to say, I think.
All right, thank you. So Michal asked me to finish the moderating. I think there was some issues with the internet. Great talk, and we have time for a couple questions, perhaps. All right, I have a question. So in the when you were talking about changing the chemical potential, is this so so I don't know, naively at least I expect that your topological mode also starts to leak into the bulk due to that.
Right.
Is that the expectation, or do you have something else in mind?
So what we see is indeed that if we start at very small potential energy difference, then you get your normal spectrum as without the wall. And then as you slowly increase it, you see that there are some modes appearing in the center, but they look very similar to the ones that hybridize with the bulk band, so that the slope is less steep and it wraps around more often somehow, this edge mode. And as you increase the chemical potential, at some point you see this nice linear dispersion emerge. And what we find is that, which is maybe expected, in the Haldane phase, this minimum value of the wall height is more or less given by the gap between the bands, so the energy gap between the two bands. And for the anomalous phase, it needs to be much, much larger. So it's more or less related to the modulation frequency. This is what we have seen. I'm actually not 100% sure why it's tied to the modulation frequency. It could also be smaller than that, because our bands are dispersive. So actually the gap is smaller than the modulation frequency. So this is something that we still need to look in a bit more detail.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. Let's see. I see Luis. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, just a short question. How large are the systems that you can do now at the moment, and how large do you think that you can go in the next years?
Okay, so that depends on what you want. So this system here is actually very, very large, but we do not have local control. Okay, so we have the control of making these small localized wave packets, but they're still on the order of many lattice size. So 1.1 micrometer should be compared to the lattice constant, which is about 280 nanometers. But I can tell you from our other experiment, the cesium experiment, where we're also looking at topological physics, there we have local control. We have a quantum gas microscope, and we have just managed to increase our system sizes to more than 3,000 atoms. So this is actually a fairly large system.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. I don't think I see any more questions. So let's thank Monika again. And we will reconvene tomorrow for Michael Rexman's talk on topological Floquet photonics. Thank you.
Bye.